Hello. In this video, I'm going to be talking about the standardization of English. This is the second in a series about this topic, and in this particular presentation, I'm going to be focusing on some issues related to vocabulary, spelling, and dictionaries. Standardization of language, of English, is fundamentally about fixing the language, right? So what exactly does this mean? Well, in part, it's about fixing it in time, that is, stabilizing it, making sure that it can't change anymore, sort of setting it in stone in terms of how it might change over time. That sense of fixing. But it's also about the probably more familiar sense of fixing, about fixing it up, right? Improving it, making it better, right? That's a key concern that is addressed by a lot of the standardizers in the history of English. The first area of language we're going to explore is vocabulary, or what linguists like to call the lexicon, the word stock of a language. For people in the Renaissance, this is a fairly obvious element of English that they thought needed attention, right? Remember that for centuries after the Norman conquest, French was the dominant language in many key areas, official government, the law, and so forth, right? So English was the most commonly spoken language, right? The vast majority of population spoke English and only spoke English. But being a medium for everyday conversation puts different demands on a language than do other functions of that language, right? You need different words for doing some things than you do for doing other things. Vocabulary is one obvious part of this problem. Right? Imagine just, for example, that you wanted to write a technical manual for your phone or your computer, and you wanted to write that in a language that is spoken in a culture that has never had phones or computers, right? They probably wouldn't have a word for phone or for computer chip or for any of the other concepts you need to write about. So what do? Well, you've got to come up with some words. That's sort of the problem that English found itself in after the medieval period, right? The beginning of the Renaissance and the early modern period. In that early modern period, the perceived problems related to vocabulary, like so many other linguistic problems, as we'll see later, these were exacerbated by comparisons to the classical languages, right? This is the Renaissance, and influential writers were well versed in Latin and Greek. So they looked at those languages and they saw a vocabulary that was rich in synonyms and lots of words to convey fairly subtle shades of meaning. But then when they looked back at English, they found it didn't really have that. They found it wanting in that sense. So they reasoned that English needed more words, right? So how do you get more words? Well, you could just make them up, right? Coin new words, or you could take your existing stock of morphemes, of meaningful units, and sort of recombine things, cook up some new words in that sense, right? But that's a whole lot of work. There's a much easier way to do this. And that is, of course, to just borrow them from other languages. And that's, of course, what English did. So this tendency for borrowing words from Latin and Greek into English, this led to something known as the inkhorn controversy in the 16th century. Right? It's called the inkhorn controversy because the inkhorn is the container, right, originally made of a horn, an animal horn, later just a bottle or whatever, but it's the container that you had ink in, right? So you stored your ink in there, and then you would dip your quill into that ink when you were writing, right? So it's called the inkhorn controversy after that object. The controversy arose from a tendency to borrow words from Latin or Greek mainly, right? Some other languages, Hebrew and so forth, but mainly Latin and Greek. Actually, in some cases, it's fair to say that they weren't really borrowing existing words from those languages. Rather, they were taking the roots from Latin and Greek and sort of using them to create new words in English, right? So one of the criticisms of these words was that they were born in an inkhorn, right? And that's the origin of the term inkhorn controversy. Right? The essence of this debate was whether this was a good thing or a bad thing. Sorry, catching up a little bit. So some people wanted to argue that these new words enhanced the language, right? They made it better, they improved it in that sense. And other people would argue, no, that these words, whatever virtues they offer, they're just ultimately confusing, right? That if you don't know Latin and Greek, you have no idea what these people are writing about, right? So are they a good thing or are they a bad thing? Do they improve the language or do they harm communication? Let's look at some examples on both sides of that debate. One of the people to defend the introduction of inkhorn terms was a guy named Thomas Nash. He was a poet and a playwright. And he draws in this quote we have here on a popular metaphor that treats words like money. So let me just read this for you in a kind of modern pronunciation, right? No wind that blows strong but is boisterous, no speech or words of any power or force to confute and persuade, but must be swelling and boisterous, right? Looking for boisterous language. For the compounding of my words, therein I imitate rich men, who, having gathered store of single white money together, convert a number of those small little scoots into great pieces of gold, right? So changing money from small pieces to big ones. Our English tongue of all languages most swarmeth with the single money of monosyllables, right? All those small Germanic words. That's the only scandal of it. Books written in them and no other seem like shopkeepers' boxes that contain nothing else save halfpence or three farthings and two pences. Therefore, what did me I, but having a huge heap of those worthless shreds of small English in my piamater's purse, the piamater is a part of the brain, I had then to the compounders immediately, and exchanged them 4 into 1 and others into more, according to the Greek, the French, Spanish, and Italian. Right? So changing those monosyllabic Germanic roots into larger, fancier words from Greek and Romance languages. On the other side of the debate, some people rejected these new borrowed words. So John Cheek is a good example of that. He writes, I am of the opinion that our tongue should be written clean and pure, unmixed and unmangled with borrowing of other tongues. Right? So clearly a kind of purity of English using native English roots. Cheek, in fact, put his money where his mouth was in the sense that he wrote a translation of some Gospels, the Gospels of Matthew and Mark from the Bible, and he attempted to avoid words that didn't come from English. So he would replace even well-known borrowings with these native English coinages. You have some examples here. So instead of the word lunatic, which of course has the Latin root luna for moon, he would write mooned. A centurion is a hundreder. Prophet, he would use the word foresayer. And for resurrection, he would use the term gain rising. Again, taking these, in this case, Latin and Greek roots and replacing them with native Germanic or English roots. And you can see probably by these examples here how successful he was, right? I don't think people who celebrate Easter talk about Jesus and his gain rising. So obviously this was kind of failed attempt in that sense that they did not come to replace the borrowed words. Thomas Wilson was a rhetorician as well as someone who served in the government of Queen Elizabeth I. He also was not a fan of inkhorn terms. Here's something he wrote in 1553. I'll read it because it's lovely. The unlearned or foolish fantastical that smells but of learning, such fellows as have seen learned men in their days. They will so Latin their tongues. I really like that verb. They will Latin their tongues. That the simple cannot but wonder at their talk, and think surely they speak by some revelation. I know them that think rhetoric to stand wholly upon dark words, and he that can catch an inkhorn term by the tail, him they count to be a fine Englishman and a good rhetorician. And he concludes, do we not speak because we would have other to understand us? Or is not the tongue given for this end, that one might know what another meaneth? Right. So he's clearly arguing in favor of eliminating these dark words, these borrowings that no one can understand, because they prevent communication across people. Right? To drive home his point, Wilson appends this little letter that he claims to have come across. Right? His intent here is to show how over the top and confusing the use of inkhorn terms had become. Right? that just a small excerpt from that larger piece here, and I've added some glosses in square brackets there to certain words and phrases that might need translating. So let's take a quick look at this. Right, he writes, pondering, expending, he means weighing, and revoluting with myself your engent affability, which means your enormous affability or approachability, and ingenious capacity for mundane affairs. I cannot but celebrate and extol your magnifical dexterity above all other. Right? So you look at this, and of course you have some trouble with some of the words. Right? Expending, we don't really use in that sense. Engent, affability. You may know the word affability, but engent is not familiar to us there. You probably know the word mundane. You know, when you look at some of the other words, right? Pondering. Well, we didn't even need to gloss that. We all know what pondering means. Something like revoluting. We don't use revolute as a verb, but you're certainly familiar with the meaning because of words like revolution and revolve and so forth. Right? Celebrate, extol, magnifical. We don't say, but we know magnificent and so forth. Right? So the funny thing is that even though Wilson wrote this piece, or rather found this random letter, I should say, and he used it to illustrate just how far off the deep end things had gone in terms of borrowing obscure words. The thing for us to notice today, almost 500 years later, is how many of these words don't require any translation, right? I only had to translate a few of these phrases and words. Most of them you already know, right? So while Wilson was pointing out how crazy it was to use a phrase like ingenious capacity, for us that it may sound a little fancy, but it's not exactly a kind of word that you get quizzed on for the GRE or the SAT or something like that, right? Any educated speaker would know words like that. So the kind of moral of this story is that, borrowing is going to happen. In fact, English has a long history of borrowing from other languages. Complaints about it during the early modern period really didn't succeed in curtailing this borrowing at all. Right? Lots of words entered the language at this time and since. It's just kind of English's thing, right? We borrow words. Right? There's also kind of another broader point that this little story illustrates, and that's that people like to complain about English, but these complaints don't usually have lasting effects on the development of language. Right? The language is going to do what the language is going to do. The speakers of that language are going to get what they want out of it for their own communication purposes. People can complain all they want, but they'll have limited impact on the actual long-term development of the language. Surprise. Let's turn our attention to another issue that people raised about English in this period, and this is the problem of spelling. And specifically, I want to focus on issues related to disparities between how words were pronounced and how they were spelled. Right? This is familiar territory, so this is things like silent letters, right, which lead to disparities there, or having distinct sounds spelled the same way and having the same sound spelled in various ways. Right? These were all sorts of concerns, and there were other types of inconsistencies that they were railing against. One of the things that can be hard for us to wrap our heads around is the fact that spelling was not standardized until about 200 years ago. Right? Different authors might use different spellings for a word. Even more surprising for us is the fact that the same author might use multiple spellings of a word in the same work, right? Even in the same paragraph or the same sentence. So I really like this passage that I put up here from Sir Thomas Eliot in 1539. It's a very useful piece about dealing with leeches, but I put it up here to have you focus on how he spells the word blood, right? Just in this few sentences here, he uses 4 different spellings of the word, right? And keep in mind, this was a printed book. This was not a handwritten manuscript, right? This is just the norm at the time. This orthographic variation was perfectly acceptable, right? They just didn't have this hang-up that we have today that suggested that, well, words only have one and only one spelling, right? It's just like you could spell things in a variety of ways, and that was just okay. In fact, it's kind of amusing. There were various attempts in this period to impose some more order on English spelling. In fact, this idea of spelling reform is something that people have been trying to implement ever since this period, and you can still find people making these kinds of arguments today. If you want to Google crazy people talking about fixing English spelling, I'm sure you'll find some interesting results and organizations, probably with newsletters that you can sign up for. Anyway, one of the early spelling reformers, or rather would-be reformer, is this guy, Thomas Smith, and he wrote this book on the subject in 1568. Among some of the proposals that Smith put forward to improve English spelling, he wanted to have a total of 34 letters, right, as opposed to the, what do we have, 26 today? He wanted to add some more there, right? And you can think, it doesn't take you long to realize the kinds of things he wanted to add. So, for example, he wanted to add the thorn, right, our old friend thorn from Old English, and the theta to represent the two different th sounds. Unfortunately for him, he didn't realize that the International Phonetic Alphabet, several centuries later, would use theta to refer to the voiceless fricative, th, and ev to refer to the voiced one. But in any case, he recognized that these are two distinct sounds in English, and they should therefore have two different letters, right? Perfectly reasonable proposal. In fact, the fact that these two phonemes are both spelled th is one of the only examples in English where there is not a way to distinguish a phonemic difference in spelling in English. He also pushed the idea to eliminate redundant letters, letters like Q and C. If you think about why is C redundant, well, C might be replaced by a K in a word like cat, right? There's no reason to spell cat with a C. Or it might be an S in a word like nice, right? There's no distinct sound that is only represented by a C. And in Q is the same thing. Q could always be respelled with a K. He also was in favor of adding certain diacritics, right? Diacritics are like little marks that you add to letters, right? So accents are a kind of diacritic. Umlaut is a kind of diacritic. And then familiar to us from the study of Old English, the macron is a diacritic, and he was in favor of adding a macron to distinguish a long vowel from a short vowel, right? Well, as you consider these proposals, these elements of this proposal, you can realize that none of them, in fact, were implemented, right? So he was not successful at all in making these reforms. It may have had something to do with the fact that he wrote this book in Latin instead of English. It's really hard to get the people on board if you only write in Latin, but maybe that's my own perspective. Another spelling reformer is Richard Mulcaster. He was an advocate for different reforms in his 1582 book, Elementary. Mulcaster's suggestion, they were generally speaking more modest, and maybe as a result, he was more influential. Some of the things he suggested included dropping superfluous letters, right? So you have a word like lead, the past tense of lead, traditionally often spelled with two D's there, but there's really no need to have two D's there. You could just drop one of them and just spell it with a single D. He was a big advocate for the silent E, right, as a way of distinguishing short vowels from long vowels. So a pair like strip versus stripe, strip with the short vowel and stripe with the long vowel. Again, a convention that holds in lots of cases today. Generally speaking, he argued in favor of analogy, making sure that we were sort of consistent in that sense. So if you have the EAR spelling for a word like here, you should also use it for fear and deer, since it's all the same sound. But he would allow exceptions in the case of some very common words. So he was fine with having a different here, H-E-R-E, because that's a very common word. And so it's okay to not be consistent as long, to have these very common words. People are going to learn them anyway. Really, his main point is that uniformity, right, having everybody spell words the same way, that should be more valued than like a perfect kind of logical consistency. And of course, that's pretty much what we have with regard to spelling today. Finally, I want to consider probably the most ubiquitous product of the standardization process, and that's the dictionary. These are such a commonplace thing for us today. We're trained to consult dictionaries from a young age when we have questions about words. Of course, today this often happens with, things like dictionary.com or even just Google. But some of you may remember that not too long ago, dictionaries actually came in book form, which was kind of cool. Because they're so familiar, it's useful to note that we didn't always have dictionaries. And of course, there are many languages in the world today that don't have dictionaries for them. They are one of the tools that's used in the codification stage that we talked about in a previous presentation. That codification stage of language standardization is one where the rules are sort of set, and so dictionaries are one way of establishing and publicizing certain rules, right? But not every language has been subjected to that process of standardization, so not every language has dictionaries. In the case of English, right, the earliest dictionary-like things that we have were really glossaries, right? Just lists of words. These were used to help read Latin and other languages, right? So you'd have the Latin words, and then you'd have short glosses, or translations of the meaning in the English equivalents, right? So these bilingual glossaries were sort of the only thing that they had as far as dictionaries in Old English and Middle English. The first monolingual English dictionary, right, only English, English words and English definitions, is Robert Caudry's A Table Alphabetical, right, which is just a clever way of saying an alphabetical table. Appears in 1604. This is, if you take a look at the title page here, A Table Alphabetical containing and teaching the true writing and understanding of hard, usual words, English words, borrowed from the Hebrew, Greek, Latin, or French, with the interpretation thereof by plain English words gathered for the benefit and help of all unskillful persons, whereby they may more easily and better understand many hard English words, which they shall hear or read in scripture, sermons, or elsewhere, and also be made able to use the same aptly themselves. Right? And this really tells us a lot about the purpose of this book. Right? This is what we call a dictionary of hard words. Right? So it contains, in this case, something like 2,500 rare or borrowed words mainly, with brief definitions. Right? So it has words, as it says here, many of them were borrowed from Hebrew, Greek, Latin, or French. So they would not be the kind of usual conversational words that every speaker of English would know. Take a look at this sample page from Caudry's work, and you can see it's clearly very different from the kind of things that we're used to in a dictionary today. He lists a word, and there's a definition that comes right after it. And the definitions are generally pretty brief. There's no information about pronunciation, part of speech, etymology, any of those kinds of things that you would expect to see in a dictionary today. Just take a look here. The first item on the left-hand page, the word is expert, and it's defined simply as skillful. If you go over to the other page there under F, the first entry is fabricate, and that's glossed simply as make or fashion. Right? So very bare bones definitions by our standards. This tradition of hard word dictionaries really continued throughout the 17th century. This is an example from a work by Thomas Blount in 1661, and you can see he gives a little bit more information in his entries. His definitions are a little bit longer, and sometimes he even notes the source of a word, what language it came from. So for example, the last word in that first column is dramatic, which is a noun here. He indicates it comes from the Latin word dramaticum, and he defines it as a kind of poetry when the persons are everywhere adorned and brought upon the theater to speak and at their own parts. So what he's talking about here is clearly what we would probably use the word drama for, in the sense of a kind of theatrical performance. Right? John Kersey's 1702 New English Dictionary is really a landmark in the history of dictionaries in English. This is the first one to include not only obscure hard words, right, those that are borrowed from other languages, but also it includes everyday vocabulary. Right? Now, at first this may not seem like a big deal, right? But it represents a significant development in terms of how we conceive of and how we deal with dictionaries. Right? A dictionary of hard words like quadries, those are useful as a resource, right? You're reading something and you come across an unfamiliar word, so you turn to the book, the dictionary, to look it up and to learn what that word means, right? It's a very practical, useful kind of resource in that way. Including common words doesn't serve the same purpose, right? No one is reading something in English, right? No native speaker, at least, is going to be reading something in English, and they come across a word like mother or grass or house, and they're going to be confused. Oh, I don't know what those words mean, right? Every native speaker of English knows what those words mean. So why should they be included in a dictionary? Right? It doesn't serve any useful purpose. Well, they're included because they're part of the language, and that's the change that we see here. What Kersey is doing is introducing a new purpose for a dictionary, right? It's no longer just a useful resource for information about hard words. Now it's a kind of repository, right, for the lexicon of English. It's where the words live, right? The words are in the dictionary, and so all the words of the English language should be included there in principle. Think about how weird it would be if you were writing a new dictionary today and you didn't include words like mother or house or light, right? People would consider that work completely broken or incomplete, right? We tend to view dictionaries today in this newer way as a kind of collection of English words, right? Even though no one, or almost no one, is going to actually look up a word like mother or house or grass or light or any of those very common words. They're not there because people need to be able to look them up. They're there because they're seen as part of the language, and if they weren't there, the dictionary would not be complete. Right? This way of thinking or way of treating dictionaries really has important consequences, right? It starts to make dictionaries seen as authoritative, almost as gatekeepers for the language. Right? You probably had arguments with dumb people who like to argue that, well, some word that people use is not in the dictionary, and therefore it's not a real word, right? As if any dictionary could contain everything that is a word of English. We'll come back to this particular topic in a later discussion. Take a quick look at this sample page from Kersey's work. This is from a slightly later edition in 1706. He includes some words that probably would have been in earlier dictionaries of hard words. You can make out here probably words like doctrine and document. Those are sort of fancy Latinate words. But he also has doe. And of course, fans of Sound of Music know that the definition of doe is a female deer. And then below that you can see the word dog, and he offers the very helpful definition of dog as, quote, a well-known creature. So sort of shoving in our face the fact that I have to include the word dog here because it's part of English, but nobody really needs to look up the word dog and know what it means. They already know what it means if they're looking it up. Another landmark in the history of English dictionaries is Samuel Johnson's work of 1755. First of all, it was larger than anything that preceded it, had over 40,000 entries. Also, Johnson was probably the first lexicographer to include quotes in every entry, or in most entries, that illustrate how the words were actually used. And this is important because it sort of fills out the picture of a word in a way that just having a definition there doesn't necessarily do that. Here's a page from Johnson's dictionary, and if you look under the entry for gull there at the top right, you can see he lists 3 different senses or sub-meanings of the word gull. And then he gives quotes from Shakespeare and from other writers to demonstrate those different meanings. Right? You can see the layout there, some other familiar words and some unfamiliar words. Incidentally, if you look carefully at this, you might be able to guess why I chose to include this particular page as an illustration. If you look, it goes from gullet, G-U-L-L-E-T, to gully, G-U-L-L-Y. And so so what's missing? The word gullible. And if any of you know the really super fun joke that you can play on someone where you ask them, hey, did you know gullible is not in the dictionary? And then if they're gullible, they'll go and get a dictionary and look it up and see that it's actually in there. Well, just make sure if you try to play this joke on someone that they don't look in Johnson's dictionary, because gullible actually isn't in Johnson's dictionary. Johnson was kind of famous for inserting his own sense of humor, his own opinions, right into his work. So there's some interesting examples here in the way that he defines words. So he defines lexicographer as a writer of dictionaries, a harmless drudge that busies himself in tracing the original and detailing signification of words. That phrase harmless drudge is obviously a kind of commentary on the nature of writing a dictionary. He defines a politician, in the second definition there, as a man of artifice, deep contrivance. And then maybe most famously he defines oats as a grain, which in England is generally given to horses, but in Scotland appears to support the people. So a little Scots bashing is always a lot of fun. So this is, you really get a clear sense of Johnson's as an author, as a person in these definitions. And that's, of course, not the kind of thing you'd find in dictionary definitions today, which are much more sort of corporate written and don't give a sense of a real person behind the entries. Since we're talking about dictionaries, I think I'm obligated as an American to mention Noah Webster, probably the most familiar dictionary writer to Americans. Webster published the dictionary in 1828, and crucially, as you can see from the title, his is an American dictionary, right? And Webster was very firmly committed to distinguishing American English from British English. And incidentally, even though we probably know him best for his dictionary today, he actually did a lot of writing about language. It was one of the things he was really keen on. He wrote a grammar book, and he also had a famous spelling book. It's called the Blueback Speller. That was used throughout the 19th century to teach kids to read and write from elementary grades. To give you a flavor of Webster's thinking about language, I have this passage here from 1783. Read it quickly for you. The author wishes to promote the honor and prosperity of the Confederated Republics of America and cheerfully throws his mite into the common treasure of patriotic exertions. This country must in some future time be as distinguished by the superiority of her literary improvements as she is already by the liberality of her civil and ecclesiastical constitutions. And now for a little Europe bashing. Europe is grown old in folly, corruption, and tyranny. For America in her infancy to adopt the present maxims of the old world would be to stamp the wrinkles of decrepit age upon the bloom of youth and plant the seeds of decay in a vigorous constitution. Right, so clearly, like setting a new path for America, distinct from Europe. Notice, by the way, in the first line there, how he spells the word honor. In 1789, you can see he's continuing with some of these themes. As an independent nation, our honor requires us to have a system of our own in language as well as government. Great Britain, whose children we are, should no longer be our standard, for the taste of her writers is already corrupted and her language on the decline. Right, so again, clearly trying to distinguish American English from British English, and of course by now, 1789, he's spelling honor the way that it's commonly spelled in American English. That distinction of words like honor and color and flavor, where British English uses an O-U-R and American English just uses an O-R, that is something that Webster is responsible for, along with some other spelling innovations that he introduced. Right? But he clearly wants American English to be separate, to be a mark of this new country, and therefore to be distinct from the forms used in England. To end this discussion of dictionaries, I want to consider probably the ultimate achievement in English lexicography, and that's the Oxford English Dictionary, the OED, which of course we've done some exercise with earlier on in this semester. The OED was originally directed by, so the original efforts were directed by James Murray, who worked on it for many, many years. It was originally conceived of as, you can see the title here, a new English dictionary on historical principles. And that really sets the OED apart from other dictionaries because it means it's trying to document the English language not just as it's spoken today, but how it's always been, or the entire history of that, right? So that's why you have words that have dropped out of the language, words that only existed in Old English or Middle English. They'll still be listed there because this is meant to be a kind of historical account of the language. The publishing of it, in fact, took a pretty long time. So the first volume came out in 1884, and they continued to come out until 1928 was the last volume. So imagine that you were super excited to get the first volume in 1884, but that you wanted to look up a word that started with Z. You'd have to wait all the way till 1928 to do that. That would be super frustrating. In any case, that first edition was 10 volumes, which was remarkable for the time, almost 250,000 entries in that. There was a second edition that came out in print in 1989, and by then it had doubled in size to 20 volumes, right? So within that period it had doubled. Of course, as you're familiar with, it's now in an electronic edition, and it's continues to be added to every couple of months, right? So it's now, I don't know if it's doubled from the 1989 version, but it's definitely very much increased in length. And of course it's only electronic, so we don't actually know how many volumes it would fill if you wanted to write it all out and print it out. I don't recommend printing out the entire OED. So that's it for this presentation. Next time I'll be talking about thinking about grammarians and how people who actually focused on the topic of grammar as opposed to spelling and vocabulary and things like that, and how they used their authority, or how they tried to sort of make up their authority to get people to change the way they used English in terms of grammar. So look forward to that.